We were mid-argument before Mom finished setting the table and I could feel my blood move faster than my mouth, like the demo on my laptop was a heartbeat that wouldn't stop. I pulled the printed bound business plan from my bag and set it on the table like a dare, opened the laptop and said, "Look, this is real, this works." The prototype lit up and showed timelines, subcontractor schedules, and material tracking in a way a foreman could use without an IT degree. And for a minute I watched my parents just stare at the screen like it might bite them. My father forked through his steak without looking up and said, "Mark, you've got a good job, why gamble it away?" He didn't even try to pretend he wanted to understand the numbers. He'd called startups a gamble before, it was part of his dictionary. I felt my chest tighten because it wasn't the logic that hurt me, it was the way his voice made me feel like a reckless child instead of a man who'd spent nights coding till 2 a.m. and paid his own bills. I tried to stay calm. "Dad, I have letters of intent, real customers, and projections that actually back up what I'm asking for," I said, watching his hand go still over the plate for the first time. Mom put down the salad bowl and said, "Entrepreneurship is risky, honey. We just want you to have stability." Her voice softened when she spoke to me the way she always did when she wanted to protect me from what she feared. I wanted to tell her that stability felt like being invisible, that every big thing I did had been measured against Jason's needs and found wanting, but what came out was, stability doesn't build the life I want. This is my career, not a hobby. I wasn't trying to be dramatic. I spoke like a man who had crunched every number and still chosen the harder road because the easier one would have left me empty. Jason, playing his game in the corner, barely glanced up and smirked. "Man, you're crazy, why not just keep the safe gig?" He didn't offer ideas, just scorn. That stung more than my parents' refusal because he had been riding their coattails his whole life, doing as little as possible while they cleaned up his messes. I heard the old pattern like a song I knew the words to: "Me responsible, him forgiven." I slammed the plan down a little harder than I meant to and said, "Because I'm not living other people's idea of security. I built this from scratch. I'm asking for help, not a handout." My father waved his hand, dismissing the demo like it was a toy. "Startups fail, Mark. We worked hard to put food on the table. I can't risk that." I could see in his face he'd already decided. He wasn't listening to revenue models and timelines, he was listening to fear. I tried to explain the break-even point, the conservative assumptions we'd used, the letters of intent from mid-sized firms that actually needed this tool, not the enterprise bloated tools that left foremen frustrated every week. He folded his napkin and said, "You're young, keep the job and grow it slowly." That sentence hit like a slap. Grow it slowly. I'd done the slow, steady thing my whole life and been rewarded with a 1997 Honda and the implication that my needs were minor. I told him I already grown it slowly. "I'm at traction, I need a bridge so I can hire the right people and hit the market before a competitor copies this. If I don't move now, someone else will fill this gap." I saw a flicker in Mom's eyes then, a brief glance that might have been curiosity if it hadn't been so quickly smothered by caution. They wanted to protect me from risk, while protecting him from consequence. Jason laughed and said, "So you want us to front you 30 grand? Good luck with that." He said it like a verdict. My hands trembled. Every number I'd prepared swam into a fog of parental doubt and brotherly mockery. For a second, I almost imagined what it would feel like to fold, to go back to the 9-to-5 that paid the bills but kept me small. The thought made my stomach turn. I wasn't willing to give up the chance to build something that could support not just me, but other people who'd been stuck using broken tools on job sites. I closed the laptop slowly because I could see the argument wasn't about spreadsheets or DMOS anymore. It was about a lifetime of patterns where my ambitions were minimized and his were inflated. I said, "I'm not asking you to gamble your security. I'm asking for a bridge loan, not a blank check. You taught me to plan for risks. I'm asking you to apply that lesson to me." They looked at each other and then at me, and the silence that followed carried the weight of every time they told me I'd be fine because I was so independent. That phrase felt like a gift they never meant to give. Jason's brother had always been the family's magnet, this easy smile and a way of shifting blame that made people move toward him, not away. He could charm a room into believing his version of events before anyone else finished a sentence, and when trouble came, he acted surprised like it wasn't his fault. I watched that pattern so many times I could predict the rhythm: crisis, confession, everyone swoops in to fix it. My parents fell for it every single time, and I learned to hold my breath and count the bills instead of expecting fairness. I was the reliable one who learned to build things with my hands and my head: computers, small gadgets, and later software that did what people actually needed. I remember being 13 and asking for a $720 summer coding camp because I loved it, because it changed the way I thought about problems. My mother said, "That's too expensive, Mark." She used that phrase like a lid, and I folded it into my life. A year later, Jason wanted horseback lessons at $180 a session, and they bought a full-term, boots, and a helmet before I could finish explaining why the camp mattered. I sat on the couch and watched receipts pile up for his life while mine stayed unpaid. Sorry for the quick interruption. If you're enjoying this so far, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and leave comment below. It really helps the channel grow. Alright, let's jump back into the story. Why do you always have to make everything so complicated? My father asked me once when I tried to explain why that course would matter for my future. He said it like a shrug, like my plans were a hobby. I learned then that asking for certainty from them was asking for disappointment. They explained away my requests as risky or unnecessary, and they explained his wants as investments in happiness, in experience, in giving him a chance. That language carved a groove into how the family saw us. I was practical but expendable, he was fragile but precious. The more I did the responsible things, the more invisible I became. I fixed things around the house, I balanced numbers, I kept the old Honda running until it coughed like a dying animal, and they smiled at me like that was my natural state. Meanwhile, Jason's missteps, late fees, a suspended license, classes dropped, triggered rescue plans with a speed that made my head spin. They hired tutors, rearranged schedules, negotiated fees, and lowered expectations for him so he could breathe easy. I learned to be quiet about needing time or money, because it was obvious nobody would rush to help me in the same way. I built a privacy around my ambitions because I couldn't afford the disappointment of being dismissed again. Nights became my workshop. I taught myself to code, to design, to think like a product manager. I collected small wins like pebbles, customers who liked my prototype, comments from contractors saying it changed their week. But privately collecting wins doesn't change how it feels when the people you love refuse to see them. I remember showing Mom a letter of intent once, and she smiled politely, like she was proud but not surprised. Proud in the way someone pats a child on the head, not proud in the way someone celebrates an adult taking a risk. When Jason needed money later, things that escalated from kids' mistakes to dangerous bets. My parents took out loans, costing leases, and wiped out savings without a formal business plan just because he talked in a way that made them want to believe. He's got potential, they said like a prayer. They believed his charisma was a business model. I watched them sign papers while I was downstairs balancing spreadsheets for my startup, watching numbers that made sense and showed growth. It made my stomach sour to see money go into vanity projects and scams, while I scraped together nights and wages to keep a real product afloat. That pattern, his needs answered, mine minimized, built into the foundation of how I saw family and responsibility. It isn't a simple resentment, it's a long, grinding ache. I kept proving myself in small ways, thinking a pattern could be changed by evidence and patience. I took jobs, built a product, and tried to show that my work had real, measurable value. But evidence didn't change a lifetime of reflexive parenting. When rescue mode kicked in for him, the entire household shifted to support him like a single organism, and I felt like a limb that didn't belong. There were times I wanted to scream, to hold the business plan up and say, "You've been wrong for years." Instead, I learned to set boundaries and to build a life that didn't depend on their approval. It wasn't easy. It meant late nights, ramen, and using my mortgage as leverage so I could secure a loan. It meant leaning on logic when emotions ran hot and telling myself that my work would have to speak louder than the family narrative. Even now, when I think about the past, the old pattern stings, because love mixed with favoritism does damage that money alone can't repair. I moved to Austin after college and took a job at a small software shop that smelled like burnt coffee and ambition, and I learned faster than I ever thought I could because the work pushed me every day and I wanted to prove something to myself as much as to anyone else. I wasn't the flashy type. I was the guy who stayed late debugging, who volunteered to own the messy parts no one else wanted. Manage a deployment at midnight? Sure. Teach a junior dev the next morning? Done. Those nights stacked into skills and confidence that felt new and dangerous, like I was inventing myself all over again. Within a few years, I was managing a team and thinking less about tasks and more about problems that mattered to people who actually paid for solutions. I watched clients struggle, not because they were incompetent, but because their tools didn't match their lives. Construction kept coming up as a recurring example. Schedules that changed by the hour, subcontractors who showed up late or not at all, materials that went missing, and field workers who hated software meant for office people. The companies were mid-size, big enough that spreadsheets broke, small enough that enterprise suites felt like overkill and impossible to implement without a full IT department. I started talking to contractors in coffee shops and at job sites, learning their language, watching how they worked. We need something that doesn't require a degree, one foreman told me, wiping sawdust from his hands. Just tell me what's late, who's on which crew, and what materials we need today. That line stuck with me because it showed how far the tools were from the day-to-day reality of their crews. They wanted practical, not flashy. They wanted clarity, not another system to fight with. So I began grinding on a prototype at night and on weekends. I wrote code in the glow of a cheap desk lamp, built mock-ups between shifts, and kept my day job so the bills kept getting paid. The prototype wasn't pretty, it was functional, honest, and focused. It showed timelines that adjusted when delays happened, subcontractor schedules that reconciled automatically, and simple material tracking that told a foreman if a job would stall because a delivery hadn't arrived. I tested it with a few friends of friends and fixed things as they broke. Those early users weren't polite, they were brutal, and exactly the kind of feedback I needed. I kept talking to a dozen or so contractors, narrowing the feature set to the things that unblocked work. Little things mattered: a mobile-first interface for guys who lived on job sites, offline sync because cell service at some sites was garbage, and notifications that weren't annoying but actually useful. The conversations turned into written letters of intent from companies who said they would buy once the product was ready. 14 letters added up to roughly $200,000 in first-year revenue if I could just build the full product and bring it to market. The numbers felt real in a way I hadn't experienced before because these were not vague promises, but signed notes from people saying they'd pay. I modeled conservative growth and built a plan that showed break-even in under 2 years and reasonable margins after scale. I knew where I could cut to make the runway stretch and where I had to spend to get customers quickly. A small sales team, a couple more engineers, and time to polish the product so it didn't feel like a patchwork of good ideas. But capital was the moat I couldn't cross alone. I had saved $40,000, scraped together what I could from side gigs, and pitched the plan to friends, mentors, and eventually my parents. Asking them for a bridge loan of $32,000 felt like asking for oxygen. I rehearsed the numbers, prepared a polished presentation, and showed demos because I knew that for someone who didn't live in code, the demo would have to speak louder than the spreadsheets. I wanted them to see the actual tool doing the work and the letters of intent validating demand. I remember sitting at their kitchen table with the prototype glowing between us, feeling both pride and a kind of vulnerability I hadn't felt since leaving home. If they said no, I could absorb the rejection and find other routes, but hope is different when your plan is backed by people who will actually use your product. The refusal didn't just close a door on funding, it echoed the old pattern of being overlooked and dismissed despite evidence. That made the decision sharper and wounded in a way that was personal, not just professional. So I kept building even after they said no. I took a risk with a business line of credit, used my house as collateral, and hired a front-end developer I trusted. I launched ConstructWorks with a small team and even smaller bills, and the first year was a grind. But the product found its people. 9 paying customers by month 12, then growth that surprised even me. Those first customers were gritty, grateful, and unforgiving in the best way. They pushed the product to be better and paid for it. That feedback loop turned the prototype into something that could actually survive in the messy world I'd wanted to help. I walked out of their house that night with the business plan folded under my arm and a hollow where I'd hoped for support, feeling like the responsible son who always got told to be practical while Jason, brother, got bailouts. The kitchen light was still on when I drove away, and I could still hear Mom's voice inside the house saying, "We just want you to be safe, Mark." Safe felt like a word that kept me small, like a lid they tightened every time I reached for something bigger. The rejection wasn't just money. It was the same old message that my plans were risky while his weren't. I could have tried a bank loan first, but startups need signals banks don't like. No long revenue history, a product still being proven, and no big assets to use as collateral. I walked into a couple of banks and felt the polite brush off. Not enough operating history, one loan officer told me with a half smile that meant they were done talking. Those conversations left me with papers and forms and the clear knowing that I'd have to bet on myself if I wanted this to happen. Betting on myself meant using what I had and accepting the consequences if it failed. So I took a different path, one that felt like trading comfort for possibility. I spent 3 months doing paperwork and meeting with banks, accountants, and a lawyer who read every clause like a scavenger hunt for hidden traps. There were nights turning pages under a desk lamp, Sundays on hold with loan officers, and a constant small anxiety about the house where my family lived, about the mortgage payments I'd always made. I opened accounts, organized tax returns, and drew up personal and business cash flow projections until the numbers weren't scary anymore, just blunt facts I could defend. One meeting stands out: an underwriter looked over my projections, then at my developer's mock-ups on a tablet, and finally at the equity in my house. He leaned back and said, "This is risky, but I see traction." That was the closest thing to approval I could get without venture cash. The line of credit offer came with strings, a near 9% interest rate, and a requirement that my house be collateral. I remember the number like a punch, $36,500. It wasn't the $32,000 I asked my parents for. It was less than I'd hoped my work would deserve, but it was real money I could use to hire, to polish the product, and to get the sales engine moving. Signing those papers in the bank felt strange. I sat there and thought about every time I'd been told to keep fixing the family car while money flowed toward Jason's hobbies. I thought about the nights in Austin when I worked until my eyes hurt, about ramen dinners and coding until 3 in the morning. This loan felt like a statement. I was choosing to put my home on the line for my work, not because I wanted drama, but because I believed the product could work and I had to give it a chance. I told the loan officer, "I know the risks, I've planned for them." He nodded, stamped, and slid the documents back across the table. With the credit line in place, I moved with a focus I hadn't allowed myself before. I signed a lease for a small office, enough to separate work from life, and hired a front-end developer who had worked with me on late-night prototypes. The money covered a few months of payroll, some development tools, and a modest marketing push to get early adopters on board. It was tight budgeting, every dollar accounted for, every feature prioritized. I traded off luxuries for runway because this was the price of making something real. There were nights I lay awake thinking about the house and the loan, picturing worst-case scenarios, and forcing myself back to the spreadsheets I'd shown the bank. But gratitude and fear can live together. I felt grateful for the chance and afraid of losing what I'd built at home. I reminded myself why I had started this, to solve a real problem for real people, not to chase applause. The line of credit didn't remove risk, but it turned an idea into a plan with fuel. I told myself the loan would have to be a temporary bridge, a tool that let me move from prototype to product. If it failed, I'd learn and survive. If it worked, it would mean independence on my terms. That thought kept me honest. I would not ask my parents to fix what went wrong. I would build something that proved its worth in the market or face the consequences I had chosen. That was a new kind of responsibility, one I could live with because it was mine. I quit my job the week after the line of credit was approved, signed the incorporation papers, and told my manager I'd be leaving to chase something I believed in. I found a small office in a gritty part of town, a place with cracked sidewalks and a coffee shop that stayed open late, because I wanted somewhere that felt like work, not a spare bedroom. I hired a front-end developer I trusted, a guy who pushed back when an interface idea would have made life harder, and we set up 2 desks, a whiteboard, and a shared hunger to make this thing real. The first year was survival in the purest sense. We worked 18-hour days, ate ramen more nights than I'd like to admit, and learned to celebrate tiny wins. We pushed another build, the developer would say at midnight, and we'd high-five like it meant pizza and a day off. The grind was physical and mental. Code breaks at 1 a.m. when you're already exhausted feel like personal failures, but then a contractor would send a message saying a feature saved them a half day on a job, and it made everything worth it for a moment. There were nights I lay awake on the couch of my small apartment, running worst-case scenarios through my head and wondering if my parents had been right to worry. Month 3 brought the first real sign that this could work. A small residential builder who'd been part of my initial research group signed on and started paying. They were the kind of customer who would tell you when something was broken and then tell their friends when it worked. That contract gave us a shot at breathing, not just surviving. It meant we could improve onboarding, build out a couple of popular features, and afford a modest ad push to reach other builders like them. I remember the first month our bank account looked like it might balance, a feeling like stepping out of deep water for air. By the end of year 1, we had 9 paying customers and roughly $150,000 in annual recurring revenue. It wasn't a windfall, it was proof. Proof that the problem I was solving mattered and that people would pay for a tool that didn't demand an IT degree to use. I called my father that week, not to ask for anything, but to tell him I had customers. He listened and said, "That's good, Mark," like it was a box checked on a list. The tone felt different from the old dismissals, but I couldn't let validation from him be the goal anymore. The business needed customers, not approval. Year 2 felt like stepping on an accelerator. When we focused on the right market, the right messaging, and the right onboarding, momentum built. We went from 9 to 39 customers and hit about $605,000 in ARR. Growth brought new problems, customer support demands, scaling the database, and feature requests that split priorities. But it also brought resources to hire a salesperson and add reliability to the system. We learned to hire slowly and to measure the cost of each new feature against the revenue it would generate. That discipline kept runway in view and helped me sleep a little better. By year 3, we were approaching $1 million in ARR and started fielding acquisition interest from larger software firms who wanted a foothold in construction. The calls surprised me, not because they validated the product, but because they forced me to think about what the business was worth beyond my own sweat. One early conversation with an acquirer felt surreal. The exec on the line said, "You've got something valuable here." And I felt both proud and a little detached, like watching a child I'd raised getting praised by strangers. The offers were tempting, and I considered them seriously, but every decision felt heavy because the stakes included my house, my team, and my sense of self. The success was vindicating in a way that made the old hurts ache less sharp, but it was also exhausting. Growth brought emails at midnight from clients in different time zones, bugs that threatened uptime at the worst moments, and the slow bureaucracy of adding payroll and compliance. I learned to compartmentalize. Family history and favoritism didn't get to run the company, but the wounds they left still flared sometimes when a new problem looked eerily like an old pattern. I kept the boundary I had set with my parents, answering only through messages when necessary and protecting the business from chaotic family demands. Through it all, I reminded myself why I started, to build a tool that made real work easier for real people. The wins mattered more than approval, and the customers' stories kept me honest. I had risked my house and sleep in pride, and the payoff wasn't just in revenue. It was in the quiet mornings when a foreman texted to say the app saved his week, or when my small team finally relaxed for a half day because a deployment had gone smoothly. That kind of validation felt durable because it came from users, not from family. It wasn't clean or painless, but it was mine. While I was digging trenches of code in that tiny office, my parents dug a different kind of trench at home with money and promises, and it kept getting deeper without anyone pulling the shovel out. Jason, brother, came to them with a big smile and a slideshow that looked like a glossy magazine pitch. Weddings, corporate events, rich people wanting exotic cars for a night. He talked numbers like they were facts and charm like it was a strategy. My parents heard opportunity where I heard no operations plan. They wanted to believe him the way people want to believe a miracle. At first it was small things dressed up as research. One used Lamborghini to see how bookings work, a Porsche to test a wedding package. They financed cars, paid for detailing, and told themselves it was a learning expense. "He can handle this," Mom said to me on the phone, voice bright and hopeful like she hadn't counted the costs. My father told me he thought Jason's charisma would become a business asset. I tried to warn them gently, saying, "Charisma doesn't replace a business plan." "Who's handling insurance, maintenance, storage, and logistics?" They nodded and smiled like I was being picky, and then they signed loan papers. Jason had no fleet management background and no steady income, but he had a way of making risk sound like a short step to fame. He bought flashy websites that never launched, hired a photographer for glossy shots, and took trips that were billed as networking but came back as empty promises. "I'm building a brand," he'd tell them, voice alive with possibility, and none of the follow-through I knew took work. My parents started costing leases and lines of credit, using their bookkeeper statements and home equity as proof that the venture deserved capital. They were too willing to write checks because they saw his excitement like proof. The bills piled up faster than anyone planned. Cars need upkeep, especially high-performance machines. Tires, brakes, specialized mechanics, every check added another 1,000 or more. Insurance on exotics is not a small number, and storage costs ate into any margins. When bookings didn't appear, cash flow dried and late fees arrived. Lenders began calling, gently at first and then with edges. Repossession notices showed up like a punch in the gut, one then another. My parents tried to refinance, to consolidate, to negotiate, but the paperwork and the calls from collectors multiplied with horrifying speed. I remember Mom on the phone once, voice thin and quick, saying, "We thought he'd learn, we thought he'd grow into it." There was regret under the words, heavy and real. Jason's responses were different. He promised he'd fix it, that a big event was coming, that a celebrity booking would clear the debt. The promises never translated into wires in the account. Instead, credit card balances ballooned as they covered emergency repairs and attempted marketing splurges. The accountant they trusted called and said bluntly, "You don't have cash flow. This is risky." My parents kept telling themselves they could manage it because hope felt better than admitting a mistake. When the banks and collectors started pursuing them with real pressure, the situation turned ugly. Lawyers were hired and statements were pulled. Lenders began filing to repossess multiple vehicles at once. The repossessions were public and humiliating. Neighbors saw tow trucks hauling off the cars they thought were investments. Legal notices arrived by certified mail, and my parents' office felt the strain. Clients asked questions, uncomfortable silence followed, and they could not hide the financial panic. Each call from a creditor made them smaller in my mind, less the steady parents I grew up with and more like people who had been taken in. Then Jason disappeared, not a dramatic exit, just a slow fade of texts and calls that stopped. One morning Mom said, "I can't reach him, he left his phone on." Panic set in after the denial. Later, I learned he'd gone to another state to get help for substance abuse and to avoid the worst of the collectors. The vanishing act was part avoidance, part survival. He needed to find a place where no one knew the debts and where he could try to patch himself together. That news hit me like another blow, because it came with the reality that the high six-figure hole my parents had fallen into was now theirs to stare at. By the time everything collapsed, the total debt was into the high six figures: loans, lines of credit, repossession fees, unpaid vendors, and credit card balances. My parents' practice was on shaky ground. Clients called asking why they'd closed early or missed deadlines. The accountant sent a list of liabilities that sounded like a sentence. "We have to restructure," my father said once, voice raw, and I could hear the shame underneath. They'd tried to underwrite a dream without an anchor, and now their lives were tethered to an expensive mistake. Watching it unfold, I felt a complicated mix of anger and pity. Anger at Jason for selling a fantasy and disappearing when the bill came due, pity for Mom and Dad who wanted to help and ended up hurt. I had been fighting for my own stake to build something real, using hard plans and small margins, while my family bankrolled a show that never turned into a business. That juxtaposition stung and hardened me, teaching me that goodwill without scrutiny can become the very thing that destroys the people you love. The first phone call was soft, like someone testing the water to see if I'd jump in, and I remember the words, "We're having cash flow issues." It sounded like a line from a movie until it kept coming day after day, each call louder and more urgent than the last. At first they asked for a small amount to tide things over. "Can you wire 55,000? Mom asked, voice tight. I could hear the strain even when she tried to make it sound casual. I told her I'd think about it and asked for details. She fumbled through answers and then promised a plan to pay me back. That promise felt familiar and fragile. A week later the number had risen. 90,000, my father said over the phone like it was a spreadsheet item and not a life-altering sum. They explained it away as short-term rescue, a bridge to refinancing, things that would come together if only this amount showed up. I asked for the accountant's breakdown, for bank statements, and for a plan that made sense. They sent vague numbers and more pleas. "We just need help," Mom said, voice breaking. The way they folded urgency into pleading made it hard to think clearly, but their story also felt eerily like the old pattern. Fix the immediate mess, move on, don't examine why it happened. I remember the day they asked the coldest thing of all. My father put it bluntly, "Sell your house, Mark, liquidate the equity, 200,000 will fix this if we move fast." He spoke like it was a math problem you could solve with a single stroke. I slammed the phone down because I couldn't believe that line. This was the same family that had called my business dangerous and my prototype a fantasy. They had refused to invest a fraction of that amount in the plan I had proven with letters of intent and traction. Now they wanted me to give up the collateral I had used to get the modest line of credit that started everything. The audacity of that ask lit a fire in me I hadn't expected. My hands shook, but it wasn't from fear. It was from anger and a profound clarity. I thought about nights coding until dawn, about declaring to myself I'd take responsibility for my choices. I had used my home as security because I believed in the product and I accepted the risk as mine. I would not be the person who cleaned up this mess because others refused to be accountable earlier. I sat with that thought until the fury softened into a harder thing: boundaries. When they came to my door a few days later, quiet and ashamed, Mom asked me in a whisper if I could reconsider. "We made mistakes, Mark. We want to make it right," she said, eyes wet. Dad spoke about legacy and saving the practice and how a brief infusion could prevent bankruptcy. They stood there like people who had finally seen how deep the hole was and wanted the child they had always favored to come rescue them. I listened because I'm not a stone, but each word landed on the memory of how they treated me when I needed help. That history weighed heavier than their tears. I told them no, it wasn't a dramatic shouting match, it was a careful, steady refusal that surprised them both. "I can't do it," I said. "I won't sell my house. I used it to start my company and I have obligations because of that choice." I explained that I wasn't trying to punish them, I was trying to protect the life I built. They argued, they cried, they offered different terms, but my answer stayed the same. Setting that boundary felt like stepping out of a long shadow, and it hurt in ways I didn't expect because it also felt like cutting a cord. They tried to guilt me, reminding me of how they raised me and how families stick together. "Your family," Mom said, like that should be enough. I told them family means accountability too. "I've supported you emotionally for years," I said. "I can't be the financial safety net for choices you made with open eyes." Saying it aloud felt brutal at first, but it also felt honest. It stopped a cycle that had hollowed me out for years. After they left, humiliated and small, I felt a long list of things: relief, rage, grief, and a hard, quiet pride. I did not give them the money. I did not sell my house. I closed communication to rebuild my sanity and my business without being pulled into their emergency after emergency. The split wasn't pretty, but the space it created let me focus the way I hadn't in years. I haven't spoken to them much since. They called a few times, left messages that I didn't return, and I watched from afar as lawyers and collectors took their toll. The company kept growing and I kept working, but that refusal left a mark. It taught me an ugly, essential lesson. Love doesn't mean you surrender your life to clean up other people's recklessness. Boundaries can feel like betrayal to those who expect unlimited access to you. But sometimes they are the only way to survive and to keep what you've built from being swallowed. A few weeks later, they showed up on my porch in that tired Civic, faces smaller than I remembered, and I felt my stomach drop because I knew what hollow looks like when it comes home. Daniel, father, got out first, hair messy, eyes tired in a way time hadn't caused but worry had carved. Karen, mother, followed, clutching a small duffel like they'd planned to be gone overnight and never meant this to stretch into bankruptcy and court filings. They stood on my stoop like people who'd been unpacked by life and left with nothing comfortable to wear. Daniel started before either of them could, voice low and raw. "Mark, it's fallen apart. The house is gone. We had to sell the practice cheap to pay some creditors. Foreclosure pushed everything fast." He sounded older than his years and younger than the father who once seemed infallible. Karen's eyes moved to me like someone looking for a lighthouse in fog. "We don't have anywhere to go," she whispered, as if the words were dangerous and might break if spoken loud. My throat tightened, but I kept my face steady because I had rehearsed this moment in small ways, knowing it might come. They asked for things in the same breath: a couch to sleep on for a week, a loan to cover a deposit, help finding a cheap apartment, anything that might keep them off the street and away from collectors. Karen folded her hands and said, "We made mistakes, Mark. We were wrong. Please help us now." Her voice cracked with shame and regret, and something else I hadn't felt in a long time: fear. I listened to the list and to their confessions because that's what you do when your parents unravel. You hear them like a slow-motion fall and count whether you can catch anyone. I felt anger rise, sharp and immediate, but I let it pass through me and turned it into clarity. I thought about the nights I asked for a small loan to bridge the prototype and how they'd said no, how they called my plans dangerous and told me to keep my steady job. I remembered the way they financed Jason, brother, for years with no plan, how they mortgaged and cosigned until the bills swallowed them whole. The memory wasn't revenge, it was facts. "When I asked, you refused," I said, words precise because I wanted them to land. "When Jason asked, you bet the farm." Karen's shoulders shook with something like sobs, and she said, "We thought we were helping him get a chance. We didn't see how far he'd fall." Her hands trembled on the duffel strap and she looked almost childlike. Daniel tried to add, "We thought we could fix it, son. We didn't mean for it to come to this." Their faces were honest in ways they never had been when they defended their choices. That honesty made it worse because it was new and cutting in its own way. They asked again, softer now, for help that would let them start over: a loan, a place to stay while they found work, maybe a deposit on a cheap apartment. I felt the old script trying to pull me into a rescue role, the one I'd played for years in silence while Jason's messes were cleaned. But I'd learned boundaries the hard way, like a scar that taught me where not to touch. I told them, "I can't do it. I won't sell my house. I won't co-sign. I won't be the fallback for choices you made knowing the risks." Karen cried then, small broken sounds that made me want to step forward and fix everything. Daniel went quiet and looked at me like he was seeing the son he'd raised as an adult for the first time. "Please," he said once, voice small, "we need help." I had no muscle left for the old appeasement that had cost me years. "I can't," I said again, firmer, because this had to be the end of a pattern. I started my company with my home on the line. I accepted the risks. "I can't undo what you've done for you." There was a long pause that felt like time itself inhaling. They stood on my porch stunned and small, and I felt a strange mix of grief and relief settle over me. Grief because my parents were human and broken in ways I couldn't fix with code or calm words. Relief because the boundary held and because the life I'd built didn't dissolve under their request. I closed the door gently but firmly, and I heard the car pull away before I let myself turn around. In the weeks after they left, I stayed at my desk more hours than before, and yet I felt lighter in a way that surprised me. The silence from them was not empty. It was a kind of protection I hadn't allowed myself until then. My company continued to grow, customers called with problems, my team pushed new builds, and the business moved forward like a machine with purpose. But each win was tempered by the memory of that porch, and by a quiet ache for the family I used to know, which was now different in a way that might never heal. This choice cost me intimacy with my parents, and it cost them a safety net they once took for granted. It also taught me an ugly, necessary truth. Love doesn't demand you become someone's undoing. I had protected the life I built, and in that protection was a complicated victory, one that meant I could keep building without surrendering myself to a past that nearly swallowed everything I worked for. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. And drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts.